What Was He? By Theo Gift. Read by Miss Worm. Chapter 1. The First Time. I think it was in the second week of August, 1868, that it happened. I may not be quite right about the time of the month, or the month itself, but I am almost sure it was in August, and I know that it was summer, the summer of 1868 that I spent in Switzerland. If I make any mistakes, or there are found any discrepancies in this narrative, I hope the critics will excuse them, and not say sharp things about me, as they do of regular story writers. I say at once, I do not know how to write a story at all, and have never done such a thing before in my life. But those who have heard the account of these 3 painful episodes in it have urged me, sorely against my will, to let them be printed here, and perhaps, if they serve as a warning to anyone, if he still be in this world. Oh, but I had better tell what I have to tell, and leave you to judge whether I have been wise or not in doing so. We were staying at a guest house kept by a Madame Boulger, just outside the little town of Abondance, among the Swiss Alps. It was a charming place, a sort of big, rambling chalet, built on the wooded slope of a steep hill, commanding a glorious view of the snowy mountains which framed us in on all sides but one, and looking straight down on the little town, with its picturesque jumble of red roofs and twisted chimneys, and the narrow rock-bound river which girdled its foundations like a dark blue ribbon spangled with silver, or rushed deep and black under grim old arches which threw back its waters in wreaths of turbid foam. We were a lively enough party at the chalet, Madame Boulger being a pleasant woman, and having a knack of getting together young and pleasant inmates. I don't remember all of them, for they went and came, but I can recall a nice little Irish doctor, a handsome high church clergyman and his sister, who went down regularly each morning to early mass in the town below, a French marquise, middle-aged but fascinating, a newly married couple, also French, and Helen Joyce, with whom I was travelling. I was then 26, in high health and spirits, and unmarried, while she was still wearing her first widow's weeds. Indeed, it was as a help to recovering her spirits, sorely tried by her husband's death, that I had agreed to spend the year which had still to pass before my John would be ready for me, in travelling with her. I only mention this to show how I came to be there. Otherwise, neither my affairs nor Helen's have anything to do with this narrative, or contain the smallest interest for anyone else. Unquestionably, the most interesting members of our party were the newly married couple. They were both very young. She could scarcely have been 18, deliciously good-looking, over head and ears in love with one another, and had only been married a week. This last fact, from which the previous one naturally resulted, leaked out from the guileless chatter of the little bride herself, and naturally made them even more the central objects of observation and curiosity than they might otherwise have been. But, indeed, the young wife was pretty and innocent enough to attract notice anywhere. Fresh from the convent school, where she had passed all her young life, naive as a babe and playful as a kitten, with big black eyes, most childishly round and liquid, a little head covered with soft, short curls, and a complexion of milk and roses. The husband, however, was even more remarkable for beauty. Tall and slenderly made, with a perfectly oval face, long waving hair of a rich auburn colour, with pointed beard and mustachios slightly deeper in tint, and eyes, the like of which I had never seen before, which were, indeed, the chief feature in his face, and which, though I could not call them beautiful, as some did, would have marked the man among 100 others, after years of forgetfulness. If some of you think that this is an after fancy of mine, not existent at the time, but created by later impressions, you are wrong. What I say of them now, I thought then, and even described in a letter which is still extant. Eyes not large, but looking so, from a singular power of dilation in the pupil, produced by any intensity of feeling, pleasant or the reverse. Whites very convex, and with the dazzling opaque brilliancy of porcelain. Iris of a bright golden colour, surrounded by an outer ring of deep greenish grey, the whole shaded and made additionally noticeable by the straight, sharply pencilled brows, inky black, and slightly depressed towards the nose, a peculiarity which became intensified whenever their owner was excited to either irony or vexation, and which lent a curious, and to me, somewhat unpleasant expression to his face. The other ladies voted him as handsome as an archangel. Mr. Hume, our clergyman, suggested half-laughingly a fallen one. But whatever our opinions might be, they mattered very little to the subject of them. Those weirdly brilliant eyes of his, with their orange tawny light, a light which seemed to come from within, as in those of the leopard and nighthawk. They had vision for nothing but the charming face of his young wife, while her innocent gaze seemed to lose itself in wondering admiration as it rested upon him. They were ridiculously in love with one another. We had been talking about the glaciers one day at dinner. He had often been in Switzerland, and was describing some of his feats in alpine climbing, the while his girl wife listened delightedly, and now and then put in a whisper to one of us, "Isn't he quite the mountaineer, my husband?" Later in the evening, I happened to be out in the garden. It was not a large one, but had the effect of being so, from being laid out in a succession of terraces cut out of the steep hillside, and planted thickly with all manner of flowering shrubs and fragrant bright-hued blossoms. Strolling along the upper of these terraces, I was gazing out to where the great white mountains showed forth against a sapphire sky set thick with golden star-gleams, and inhaling the delicious fragrance of the pine woods on the other side of the little river, when I became aware of the presence of our young lovers on the path below me. They were chatting in a little nook formed by the bench and the angle of the wall, he half kneeling on the former, and supporting her as she sat on the wall, her little feet crossed and hanging down in front of her, her slender, childish figure pressed against his shoulder. She had on a black lace frock, cut so as to leave the neck and arms bare, and her pretty shoulders, charmingly white and dimpled, glittered like soft mounds of snow in the moonlight, which poured down on her in a silver rain, touching the little curls on her smooth brow, and turning to frosted bronze the crisp waves of her husband's hair, and the glossy leaves of an oleander which drooped its rosy-flowered branches above them and swayed softly in the summer breeze. Amen, mon chéri, I could hear her saying in her clear little child voice. Tomorrow, then, thou wilt take me up to the mountains and show me where to pick the edelweiss to take to mother when we return. If we can find a guide, the husband answered. But they say one ought to engage them the day before. There are so many excursionists here at present. The little bride pouted and struck him a playful blow on the mouth with a bunch of heliotrope, which she held in one small white hand. The perfume, crushed against his lips, rose up to me in a sweet, sharp puff. Guides? What do we want with guides? Have you not told me how well you know these mountains, and how often you've been over them alone? You shall be my guide, Henri. I want no other, no foreigners. But suppose an accident would happen to you, my little angel. Accident? What accident? We're not going up Mont Blanc, and the English vicar takes his sister always with him. Do you think me a coward? I think you're quite adorable, he answered, and stooping down, lifted her little sandalled shoe and kissed it. I thought it time to retire, and did so. But there had been no vulgar curiosity in my staying so long. They did their love-making perfectly openly, and there were several others besides me enjoying the perfumed air on those terraced walks. Next evening, when we came home from our drive, we found the whole chalet in a state of great excitement and confusion. The Marquise was in hysterics, Miss Hume's maid crying bitterly in the hall, while Madame, pale as death, and with her hair all limp and unfrizzled, was giving distracted orders to half a dozen servants at once. She could only answer our questions in incoherent exclamations. The most frightful accident. Dear young nouveau mari. Alas, the poor man. No, it was not he. It was his wife. That charming, fresh, all adorable child. She had ventured too near a crevasse to pluck a flower. The piece of snow on which she stood, loosened by the late rains, had slipped, and she had fallen. Dear God, it is too horrible to think of. And someone had heard the cries of the poor husband, and had come to the rescue. But it is too late. She was dead. Dead. They were bringing her body home now. Poor son Marie. Alas, they said he had tried to kill himself too. The guides who lifted her from the crevasse had to restrain him by force from flinging himself in. It was too true. We heard it all over again from the Irish doctor, who had started off at once to the scene of the disaster, and I dare say you read it in the Times of that week under the head of Alpine Accidents, and with some observations appended to it on the folly of people attempting mountain climbing without guides. Indeed, there was nothing else to say. As the paper remarked, such fatalities are only too common, and the sole thing which marked this one as specially sad was the extreme youth and recent marriage of the innocent victim. That same night, Miss Hume and I went in to see the body. It had been laid out in a lower room, and hearing that the poor child's mother had been telegraphed for, we had gathered all the white flowers we could find to strew round the corpse, and so soften the sorrowful sight to those to whom it must be agony to gaze upon. It was a far more terrible one to us than we had expected. Not that there were any horrible facial wounds or disfigurement. Curiously enough, as the servants had already told us, there was not a broken bone or bruise on the whole of the body. Indeed, it must have been the mere shock of falling from such a giddy height that killed her, for she was found quite uninjured outwardly, lying on a bed of soft snow at the bottom of the crevasse. But to look on the expression of her young face, one would have thought she had died in the most awful agony. So ghastly was the look frozen there in death. A look not of pain, but of unutterable, indescribable fear, of frenzied horror and repulsion, while the tiny waxen hands, which some pious soul had tried to bind together crosswise on the breast, were bent backwards, with the stiffened fingers curving towards the palm, as though warding off some sudden, unimaginable horror. Miss Hume could hardly bear the sight. She put her hand over the contorted baby features and said faintly, "Oh, would not one think there was no loving God behind death, when a little girl can meet it so? Fancy a mother having only that look to remember her child's face by. Has no one a veil to cover it?" I said I had, and sending her away, for she was quite unnerved, went to get it. When I returned, I forgot to bring a candle with me, and found the room in darkness, save for a broad stripe of moonlight falling through a window at one end of it upon the bier, which, with its slender white-robed occupant, stood in the centre of the floor. As a clergyman's daughter, and going to be a clergyman's wife, I had no fear of death, and not thinking that there was anyone else in the room, I was going in softly when I stepped back, shocked and startled at finding myself in the presence of the widower. He had not seen me. He was standing at the farther side of the bier, his tall figure slightly bent over it, his arm raised high above his head, with his hands wreathed together, and waving to and fro, as if in utterance of some prayer or malediction against the woe which had fallen on him, while, though the spot where he stood was all the darker for being just outside that one ray of light, I could see his eyes dilated to double their usual size, and blazing like two unearthly lamps with a ghastly yellow glare, which seemed to positively irradiate the dark and tortured face beneath them. Fully believing that the man had gone out of his mind with grief, I fled, pale and terrified, to my room, where I found Helen's maid was already packing our things for going. She said that, considering the state of her mistress's health and spirits, she had persuaded her not to remain in a house with death in it so soon after her own sad loss, and that after some discussion Helen had agreed to leave on the morrow. I was not sorry to hear it. Chapter 2. The second time. Will be sure and call on me if I can be of any use, Mrs. Critchett. I will, mum, thank you, and glad I should be to do so if it were in the night and the nurse not here. They have engaged one. I made a point of it when I let 'em the rooms, seeing as how that was a thing I could not feel called on for, with me other lodgers to see and all. But from what she says now, I shouldn't be a bit surprised if it was before the time. These young things never do calculate right with her first. Has she no mother, Mrs. Critchett? She hasn't, mum, which is maybe the reason I feel for her, being young too, as I said, and more ignorant of the world and its wickedness than 9 out of 10 girls nowadays. A most pious and godly young creature as ever I see, and not over strong. Sits there doing her bits of sewing for the baby as is coming, with her Bible on her knee all day long, and sleeps with it under her pillow at night. Even my husband, he says it's as good as reading a chapter to hear her talk, which, no offence to you, mum, all the same, as of course she's nothing but a Quaker, which naturally you being a clergyman's wife might object to have anything to do with. I should object to myself very much, Mrs. Critchett, if I had any such feeling, or my husband either. So don't forget to mention to your young lodger that if she feels nervous or ailing, there is a lady upstairs who will be very glad to come and see her, or to help her in any way. It was the winter of 1875. I had been married nearly 6 years, and John and I were living in lodgings in Guildford Street, Bloomsbury, not far from St. Thomas's Church, where my husband was senior curate. I should have preferred a house of my own, but circumstances made lodgings more practicable to us just then. They were very clean, comfortable ones, and kept by an exceedingly worthy woman. We had the drawing-rooms and the best bedrooms above, and besides us there were in the house 3 other lodgers, a clerk in some city house and his wife, who occupied the dining-rooms, and a queer old bachelor who lived in one room at the top of the house, and whom we had never yet seen, though he was an older resident than ourselves, and we had lived with Mrs. Critchett for over 3 years. As for the couple downstairs, they had only been there for 3 months, and all I knew of them was that I used to get a glimpse now and then of a stoutish, thick-set young man, with light hair and a florid complexion, going into the city of a morning. Also, that he and his wife had not been married long, and that she was understood to be in a delicate state of health. Probably, for that reason, she went out very seldom, except after dusk, and leaning on her husband's arm. And though I had passed her 2 or 3 times on the staircase, or at the door of her room, I had no very distinct impression of her, save of a fair, slenderly made young woman, with a very good, pure-looking face, to which her simple, dove-coloured gowns and muslin caps lent a certain soft attractiveness. My offer to be of any service to her in her trouble, however, had not come a day too soon, for that very night the summons arrived. About 9 o'clock, Mrs. Critchett came running to tell me that poor Mrs. Jones was took bad. Her husband had gone for the nurse and doctor, and would I mind stepping down and comforting her a bit? Of course I went. There was not very much for me to do, however, though my inclination to do it was enhanced now that I had time to appreciate more thoroughly the absolute beauty of holiness shining from the pale young face which I found lying so patiently on its pillows below. She was very weak and suffering a great deal, but she made no complaint or fuss, and indeed hardly spoke, except to utter a gentle thank you now and then, or a more pathetic, "Thou art very good to me, friend," It grieves me to trouble thee. When the doctor arrived, he said all was going on as well as possible, and indeed, a very few minutes after Mr. Jones returned with the nurse, who lived at the other side of London, and had not expected to be wanted so soon, everything was over, and there was another tiny citizen more in the world. I had gone back to my rooms by then, not wishing to be in the way, and thinking that between husband, nurse, doctor, and landlady, those very small apartments downstairs would be sufficiently tenanted. Indeed, I was in the act of telling John, who had just come in, all about it, and what a nice, gentle creature the young Quaker wife seemed to be, when the stillness which had followed pleasantly on the late bustle and upset in the house was broken by a sudden, hoarse shriek. Then an opening and shutting of doors, and the sound of footsteps hurrying to and fro. "Something is wrong. What can it be, John?" I said, getting up and looking apprehensively at my husband. And almost in the same moment, Mrs. Critchett's maid came to the door with a breathless message. "Oh, if you please, mum, Mrs. said, could you come at once? She thinks Mrs. Jones is going." Going? By the time I'd got from my room to hers, it was plain that she was so far gone that the eyes into which mine looked would never know me, or any other earthly thing again, on this side of the grave. In sober truth, I hardly knew her. The apartment had been tidied and put straight, and there was a pleasant glow of fire and lamplight in it. The latter, carefully shaded from the face which lay back upon its pillows, just as I had left it barely an hour ago. But during that short time, such a change had come over the features as no mere womanish pain or distress had had power to bring them previously, and before which all that exquisite, calm trustfulness which had been their principal characteristic before was blotted out as completely as though a livid and alien mask had been pressed down upon them. And such a mask, such a ghastly presentment of unutterable woe, horror, and repulsion, agonized, terror-stricken repulsion, as I had never, in all my life, seen on any human face before, save one. The face of that girl bride who perished in the Swiss Alps. I had forgotten her. The whole incident had slipped from my mind until recalled to it now, 7 years afterwards, by that never-to-be-forgotten look of mortal, unendurable terror, repeated even in the very pose of those poor hands, which, damp and clammy in death's closing grasp, were yet lifted up with the palm turned outwards, and the fingers slightly curved, as though in a last effort to thrust from her something, or some vision too horrible to see and live. She was not quite dead, however, though the only sign of life was a faint, convulsive shivering of the limbs and lips, and both the nurse and landlady vied with me in striving, by applications of ice, brandy, etc., to recall the fast ebbing sands of existence, the while the last-named woman answered as well as she could my horror-stricken inquiries as to the cause of the terrible change before me. Mum, she was going on as well as possible. Very weak, but nothing in the world wrong, although the baby, poor thing, is but a measly bit of a creature, and not like to live, so the doctor says. He had done all as was needed and was in a hurry to get off to another case. So after he'd spoke to Mr. Jones and told him he might go in and see his wife, as was asking for him, off he went. And I let him out myself, and then went into the little back room there to nurse who was tending the baby. She told me she'd just shown the gentleman in here and bid him be careful not to excite this good lady. But indeed, there seemed no fear of that, for he went in as soft and quiet as a mouse, while she was lying smiling on her bed like any angel, as calm and still. And an angel she's been all through, I said, when the words were hardly out of my mouth, when there come a shriek from this room as you might have heard upstairs, and as hardly sounded like her voice, although we knew it could be no other. Nurse and me, we rushed in, and there she was, sitting bolt upright in bed, with her arms lifted up, and her face like it is now, and him, Mr. Jones, I mean, trying to lie her down and soothe her. We put her back almost by force like, for she seemed quite unconscious and stiff, as if she was having a fit. And he begun telling us he'd hardly said a word before a donkey, as was kept in a yard near by, suddenly brayed out loud, and so startled her she sprang up in bed with the scream we heard. When nurse here, she stopped him and bid him run for dear life after the doctor and fetch him back. Never mind what frightened her, said she, but go this minute. She's dying now, and if you don't catch up with him, she'll be gone before you get back. There was a knock at the door at that instant, and with the exclamation, "Here he is," Mrs. Critchett broke off in her narrative and hurried out. A second later, and we heard her opening the front door and speaking volubly to someone there. Then steps coming along the corridor, and another voice, a voice that somehow sent a cold, strange thrill through me, though I had no recollection of ever having heard it before, asking in tones which, low as they were, penetrated clearly to where I stood, "Is she still alive?" Someone else heard the question besides me, the dying woman. I was holding her, supported on my arm, and at the first sound of that voice I felt a sharp, swift shiver run through her entire frame, while for one instant the secret horror hidden behind those glazed and staring eyeballs flashed into sudden life. The white lips met with a sharp, hissing gasp, and then dropped apart. The hands fell heavily at her side. The eyelids closed. She had died while her husband was still asking if she lived. Involuntarily, I sank down upon my knees and bowed my head upon the bedclothes. At such a moment, the moment when a soul is suddenly torn away from earth and set before the judgment seat of God, prayer seems the fittest and only attitude for those called on to witness the solemn change. Another step had, however, already entered the room, and as it slowly advanced to the foot of the bed, I looked up, meaning to say such poor words of sympathy and comfort as might come to my lips to aid the man so terribly stricken in the first recognition of his bereavement. They were never uttered. Instead, I found myself staggering dumbly to my feet, with eyes fixed and staring, and a sudden icy coldness at my heart, as though every drop of blood there had been jerked violently towards my confused and startled brain. Where and when had I seen before? Not this man now facing me, this plain, dull-browed, sandy-haired English clerk, with whose back view only I had hitherto been familiar. Not him, but his eyes. Eyes unlike in shape and colour every other feature in his face, dark and sinister, with abnormally dilated pupils, black, sharply lined brows, with a deep depression towards the centre of the nose, and irises of a lurid orange hue, which seemed to glow and scintillate as with some inward flame. I have no remembrance of how I left the room. Next morning, before I was up, John spoke very seriously to me, warning me never to say to anyone else what I had told him the previous night, and blaming me for letting my imagination, as he called it, affect my nerves and moral judgment in the way it had done. He pointed out to me that sudden death might not unnaturally leave a more painful expression on the face than a gentle or lingering one, and that it was the recollections so suddenly recalled to me by this one, when I was tired and overexcited, and not any real resemblance, which had induced me to fancy a similarity between the personality of our fellow lodger and the handsome young Frenchman of 7 years back. He told me also that he had seen the former several times, and could not detect anything weird or unusual in his eyes, save that they, as well as the brows, were rather darker than the general tone of his colouring warranted, and that from what he heard from the nurse and doctor, he was of the opinion that the poor young woman's death resulted from perfectly natural causes, and such as would most probably be induced in a nervous woman in her condition by any sudden fright or strain to the nervous system. He said this, and a good deal more, and I listened and was silent. I even tried to believe that he was right, and did not ask, but was she a nervous woman, or one peculiarly the reverse? And why should I, on whose strength and common sense you have relied for 6 years, and who have stood with you beside many and many a deathbed, and helped you to comfort all sorts and conditions of mourners, turn suddenly, and without any cause, nervous and fanciful also? That evening, Mrs. Critchett came to tell me that the baby was dead also, and that the widower had given her notice, saying that he could not bear to stay in the house once the double funeral was over. She added, not that a day-old child can make much difference to him, poor man, and for my part I think it's better out of the way. It was miserably delicate from the first, and had the queerest eyes, black and uncanny as a little imp. For that matter, there's something about the fathers, God forgive me for saying it of him, poor soul, which always make me feel a bit creepy. Did you ever notice them, Mum? Chapter 3. The Third Time. What follows is taken from my last year's notebook, the Christmas week of 1882. I copy it just as it stands, without any alteration whatever, save as regards the actual name of the town and people concerned in it, as I am still living in the former, and my husband is rector of the parish. It might possibly be injurious to him or others were I to omit this one caution. November 25th. Just a month to Christmas, our first Christmas at the rectory. What a stately, comfortable sound it has, and how well it suits John. He seems actually growing stouter to fit it. Martha tells me that the house adjoining ours is let at last. I am glad of it, for it is a serious drawback to our pretty, cheerful home to be obliged to look out on those desolate weed-grown gardens, those rows of gaunt and shuttered windows. It's a large house, too, and one of the oldest in the place. They say one wing dates back nearly 200 years, but it belongs to a family who do not live there, and has been unlet for a long time. I believe there is some talk of its being haunted, and that tenants will not stay in it. I hope the new ones will prove exceptions to the rule. It is quite cheering even to see the huge iron gates standing open, and painters and glaziers already hard at work all over the premises. November 30th. I have been listening to a terrible story today. A ghost story, too, of all things in the world for a sober rector's wife to give ear to. But as it relates to the Priory, the name by which the house adjoining ours is known, and explains the holy horror with which even the school children regard that mansion, I thought I might be excused for letting the old woman who comes to mend my carpets give me her vision of the legend in question. I need hardly say that she believes in it most implicitly herself. It seems that about 100 years ago it belonged to a member of the Thorpe family, who had made a very unfortunate marriage. That is to say, he had married a very young and lovely girl who had all the outward semblances of purity and innocence, and who, nevertheless, turned out to be as shamelessly wicked as what old Mrs. Luton calls the baddest lot in the town. Not content with being false to her husband, she used his absence in America, on diplomatic business connected with our ratification of the lately fought-out independence of the colonies there, to turn the dignified old priory into a pandemonium of such reckless licence and dissipation as filled the whole county with the scandal of the doings there, and caused her dissolute companions to be publicly hooted in the streets of the township. It is surmised that she and one of them had planned an elopement to take place before the return of the injured husband from abroad, and so place her in safety from his wrath. But if so, her scheme was frustrated. Major Thorpe returned 3 weeks sooner than had been expected, and was met on landing by an old servant who had left the Priory in disgust at the scenes enacted there, and who lost no time in acquainting his master with them. The scene which followed must have been a terrible one, for even at this distance of time the old woman's voice sank, and she looked furtively about her before telling of it. At first, indeed, Major Thorpe said naught, but struck down and went nigh to murder the man who had dared to blacken his wife's name to him. But when convinced of the truth of his story, he lifted his 2 arms to heaven, and swore so terrible an oath of vengeance as curdled the very blood of the listener to hear, offering himself to perish everlastingly in the nethermost flames of hell, if for those dishonoured 7 months of his absence he might be allowed, not only to punish her who had polluted them, but once in 7 years to wreak such residue of his wrongs as her mere death could not atone for, on some other woman, young and pure and innocent as she had seemed to be, and so satisfy his tortured soul for the worse torture that first woman had inflicted on him. Next day, it was rumoured among some in the town that Major Thorpe had been seen in the neighbourhood, and one old gardener even swore to having seen a figure which he recognised as his master's, lurking among the shrubs in the priory garden. But no hint of this reached the guilty revellers within, or perhaps they might even then have escaped the doom hanging over them. That same night, a sudden cry of "Fire!" was raised in the quiet old town, and folks roused from their sleep and rushing to the spot saw flames pouring from the lower windows of that part of the priory which the frail Mrs. Thorpe inhabited. The servants, who slept in another wing, were already awaked and had made good their escape, but all their attempts at rescuing their mistress proved futile. The door opening from the great hall to her suite of apartments being found to be locked and barred, while through crack and keyhole poured a crimson glow which showed that all within was already a sea of roaring flame. And then, while the shrieks of the victims within and the crowd without rent the air, and while some ran for water and some for ladders, and some fled hiding their eyes for very fear and horror, there was seen at one of the upper windows an awful sight. For there, during the space of 1 minute, there appeared, as if painted against a curtain of lurid red and framed in wreaths of smoke, 3 figures, a man and woman, and between them Major Thorpe, holding a hand of each clasped together in the iron clutch of one of his, and with the other levelling a pistol menacingly at the head of the man, whose left arm hung, evidently broken, at his side, the while the woman writhed and shrieked and clung to him with vain cries for mercy. 1 second, I say, this was visible. The next there came an awful crash, as though a magazine had exploded at their feet, and in a breath the whole front of the house, roof, windows, walls and all, disappeared and crumbled away in a vast sheet of white flame, which shot high into the air and sank down, carrying those 3 figures with it. No smallest portion of their bodies was found when the ruins came to be searched afterwards, and in course of time the Thorpe family rebuilt the house as it now stands and announced it as to let, but already an evil name had accrued to it. People spoke of cries issuing from the empty rooms, and of a shadowy male form seen prowling along the galleries of the one wing of the ancient building still remaining, or in the deserted garden, and though tenants came, it was only to go again the more quickly. It remains to be seen if the new people, an Indian colonel and his wife, will be braver. But I am half ashamed to have listened to such a farrago of romance and superstition after all. I hope no one will whisper a word of it to my little Joe. He is fond of making his way into that garden and playing there. December 15th. They are come, and I have seen them. That is, I've had a distant view of them from my bedroom window, as they stood on their lawn together. He, a tall, white-haired, soldierly-looking man, with a long moustache. She, a singularly slender, graceful woman, in black, with a large silver cross round her neck, and seemingly much the younger of the two. People who have met them tell me they are both delightful, and the greatest acquisition to the place that it's had for years, but I fear we are not fated to know much of them. Colonel Thorpe, he is a distant cousin of the owners of the house, is an avowed free thinker, and his beautiful wife, what sounds far worse in the ears of our good townsfolk, a papist. A most devout one, too, Lady Fanshawe, our patron's wife, told me, had set her heart on going into a convent when Colonel Thorpe met her, and fell so in love with her he persuaded her to marry him instead. A sweet creature, with a delicious nun-like unworldliness added to her new matronhood, which makes me quite in love with her myself. You mustn't call there, however. That bad colonel hates parsons, and swears he won't have anyone from a parson's house inside his. Isn't it dreadful of him? And his wife, I said. Oh, my dear, didn't I tell you she was a Romanist? And you know the ill feeling here against the late rector for his ritualistic tendencies. It would never do for you or your husband to seem to run after her. Your parishioners would be in arms against you at once. What narrow, narrow places provincial towns are. December 23rd. Something has happened which has upset me terribly. I do not know what to think of it, whether I am under a delusion, or am not so strong as I was, nor what it portends, if indeed it portends anything. If only John were here. But he left yesterday for Dulminster on a visit to the bishop, and will not be back till this afternoon. Perhaps, too, he would only laugh at me. Once before, that time in Bloomsbury, he said it was imagination. And now... But I had better write it all down. Perhaps, if it looks ridiculous on paper, I may be able to feel the foolishness of it myself. I was going down to the church yesterday afternoon to see about the decorations. There is a narrow lane dividing the priory grounds from the churchyard, which makes a short cut from our house to the latter, and along this I was hurrying, when midway in it I encountered Colonel Thorpe. He was carrying a leather handbag, as if bound on a journey, and as it was the first time I'd had an opportunity of seeing him close, I naturally slackened my pace a little, so as to get a better view of him. Believe me when I say it, I had no other thought in my mind, no other motive than the natural womanly curiosity to look at one who was not only our nearest neighbour, but a man of good position in the county. And my first glance at the tall, erect figure, the white locks and the long grey moustache, with pointed military tips, gave me a distinct feeling of admiration. In the same moment, however, I was conscious of a change coming over me, a kind of coldness mingled with a nervous thrill, which quickened as he grew nearer. Instinctively I hung back, a sort of chilled expectancy, though of what I knew not, clogging my steps, while, by contrary impulse, dread blended with desire drew my eyes more and more eagerly to his. A double wave of memory seemed to sweep over me, sharp peaks of dazzling snow rising against a sapphire sky, the scent of heaped white flowers on a silent form, and anon a close sick room, cold clutching hands, and the wail of a babe nearby. A mist was gathering over my gaze. My hands felt cold, my head giddy, and instead of the man before me, I seemed to see the outline of a window filled with lurid flame, and gleaming out of it a pair of eyes, fierce, dark, with hugely dilated pupils, and irises of a tawny yellow, glowing like two hellish coals with inward fire. The very eyes, God help me now as I speak the truth, which 7 years before had met mine over the lifeless body of the city clerk's young wife, which once again, 7 years before that, had lit with such a wild and ghastly glare the dark face of the young Frenchman in the Swiss chalet. And then, in the same moment, the mist cleared, and I saw the eyes only, and knew that they were in Colonel Thorpe's face, and that they recognised me. Aye, believe it or not, they did, and I knew it. Not by any process which I could describe to you, for indeed I am not clever at analyses of any sort, but by that nameless sympathetic flash and thrill, that upleaping something in the gaze, which says to you, and every one meeting it, whether they can answer it or not, I know you. There was no syllable spoken, no pause on either side. We met and passed, and I went on to the church, but in such a tumult of feeling as I pray God I may never experience again. So shaken and filled by an overpowering sense of some terrible impending calamity, which nevertheless I did not think of as affecting me, as shook me to my very centre with impotent terror and anxiety. For what could I do or say that would not proclaim me a hopeless maniac, were I to strive to avert an evil which even in my madness, if madness it were, I could not dare to put into words, if I could find words to put in it, and which all the time I felt myself hopelessly powerless to avert? How could I call at the Priory, intrude on its stately young mistress, and implore her to fly from her home and seek shelter with a stranger like me, or anyone else, from her own natural protector, the husband for whose love she had given up her own holiest hopes and ambitions? And yet it was over her head I knew the doom to be impending, and hour by hour, as I sat trying to work or read in my own peaceful house, I felt it coming, nearer and nearer to the ill-fated one adjoining us, and saw again the mocking, pitiless gleam of those eyes, defying me to war against the lost soul behind them. And it only wanted 2 days to Christmas. Everything else looked so gay, so tranquil. I even caught a glimpse of her during the day speaking to a couple of poor tramps at the gate, and bringing them bread and meat with her own hands. I must hurry on. When night came, I could not sleep. I had felt better and more cheerful during the evening, In fact, I had taken the trouble to ascertain that Colonel Thorpe had really been starting for London when I saw him that afternoon, and would not return till next day. The doom, then, whatever it might be, was not to fall immediately on its innocent victim. Providence might even yet show me some means for warding it off, and directly I felt this, my spirits rose, and I even felt able to laugh at myself for my forebodings, and to feel glad John was not at home to scold me for them. But after I was in bed, sleep would not come to me. I was not ill or feverish. My head did not ache. There was nothing the matter with me, except that, try as I might, my eyes would not close in slumber. I remained wide awake for a couple of hours or more, and at last, wearied of lying thus, got up and went to the window, meaning to look out at the night before lighting a candle and trying to read myself to sleep. It was then just on the stroke of 1. The whole town was asleep and in bed, and over everything reigned that perfect stillness which, in London, it is impossible to find at any hour. Opposite me was the Priory, shuttered and silent too, and its gardens white with frost, and bathed in the full rays of the moon, save where a belt of trees or shrubbery cast darkly waving shadows upon the silvery surface. I was still gazing when suddenly one of these shadows seemed to detach itself from the rest and glide forward with a motion suggestive of some crouching creature unwilling to be seen. Involuntarily, the old woman's story of the Priory ghost flashed back upon my mind, and I leant forward to see better. But in the same moment the moon passed behind a cloud, and the shade disappeared, sucked back into the general obscurity of the shrubs through which it had seemed to be creeping. Only for an instant, however. The next, the full silver orb rode out again, calm and bright as ever upon the blue expanse, and as it did so, the bushes swayed and parted, and out from among them stepped a tall, black figure, which stood erect in the moonbeams. No ghost, but a man, and the man I had thought of as at that moment far and safely away, Colonel Thorpe. There was no mistaking him, no possibility of delusion. For 2 full seconds he stood there in the white moonlight, dressed as I had seen him earlier in the day, with his blanched hair and long curved moustache glittering in the silver rays. And then he plunged again into the shadow and disappeared in the direction of the house. January 30th, 1883. It is many weeks since I have written in my diary. I have been ill for almost the first time in my life. Very ill. They would not even let me write letters for some time, but now that I am well and feeling strong again, I must add a few words. I think it was about midday on Christmas Eve that the news reached us that young Mrs. Thorpe was dead. The lady's maid had found her bed unslept in the morning, and on search being made, she was discovered in the library, a room in the older part of the house, on her knees, and stone dead. It seemed that she had told the maid on the previous evening not to wait up for her, as she had promised to do some copying for the Colonel, which might keep her up late. And from her position, combined with the papers on the table and an overturned chair behind her, it was surmised that she had been suddenly startled from her occupation by some sight or sound, though what none could say, and had actually died of fright. Colonel Thorpe was away in London at the time, but by a curious chance had left for home before the telegram summoning him arrived, and he appeared among the bewildered and terrified servants within half an hour of their discovery of his wife's body. One of them told me afterwards it was a sight to make the bravest shudder. He standing there, gazing at her as if turned to stone, and she, his wife, stretched at his feet with that awful look of terror, the terror that had killed her, still staring dumbly from her dead face, and the silver cross she generally wore, held stiffly up in both the poor cold hands, as if in mute appeal to heaven. The husband has gone abroad again now, and the priory is once more untenanted. They say it will be pulled down, for that after what has happened this time, no one will ever live in it again. With this fragment from my diary, my story ends. I have nothing more to say, and no arguments to put forward. If, indeed, such a thing be possible as that he who permitted the evil one to exercise his will on holy Job, and suffered to take place the yet more mysterious temptation of the desert, should, for some unknown dispensation, have allowed the curse of a lost and reckless soul to take actual form and shape, and by the mere revelation for one instant of its infernal personality, crush out as instantaneously and irremediably the spark of life in its hapless victims, it is not for me to say. Nor is this the place for the discussion of such suggestions. All I wish to repeat, and I do so most earnestly, is that the facts I have narrated did actually take place, and that I, a practical, commonplace, unromantic woman, did actually see and witness them. If to other minds they offer an easy and unalarming explanation, I am glad of it, but I would rather not discuss it with them. I will only mention that both Miss Hume and the landlady in Guildford Street are anxious to confirm my account of the events relative to the latter's lodgings and the Swiss chalet.